Mr. Taylor, against the advice of this court, you are waiving your right to financial discovery. Do you understand what you are doing? The voice of Judge Harrison bounced off the varnished oak panels of the Johnson County Courthouse, thick with a warning. Anyone else would have heeded. But my husband Richard did not hear warnings. He only heard the sound of his own impending victory. He adjusted the lapels of his tailored charcoal suit, leaned forward in his leather chair, and flashed a smirk I had spent 18 years decoding. It was the smile of a man who believed he had just outsmarted the room. He was demanding the house, the cars, and every dollar of my corporate savings so he could restart his life with his ex-wife Valerie. And I was letting him take it. He opened his mouth to say, "Yes, Your Honor," but before we get to the exact second my husband bankrupts himself on public record, I have a question for you. How old are you right now? Drop your age in the comments, and welcome to Pana Vengeance, where we know the greatest retaliation is sometimes just handing a greedy man the shovel and letting him dig. To understand how Richard willingly sealed his own fate with a single stroke of a pen, you have to go back exactly 3 months to a quiet Tuesday evening in our kitchen in Overland Park, where the first domino tipped. The Kansas sunset was bleeding through the bay windows, painting the granite countertops in shades of bruised purple. I sat at the island, reviewing a stack of quarterly projections. The house smelled like roasted garlic and fresh basil. I was 52 years old, a commercial real estate consultant who had spent 2 decades turning a drowning regional sales manager into a man who wore silk ties and drove imported cars. I heard the garage door rumble. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hall. Richard walked in. He did not take off his coat. He did not loosen his tie. He stopped near the refrigerator, planting his feet apart. "I want a divorce, Isabel," he said. His voice carried a rehearsed, flat rhythm. "And I need you moved out by the end of the month." I kept my hands folded over my spreadsheets. The paper beneath my fingertips felt rough and dry. I looked up, taking in the man I had financed for nearly 20 years. He stood there, posturing, waiting for hysterics. He wanted tears. He craved a frantic plea for him to reconsider. That was how our dynamic had always operated. He created the crisis, and I scrambled to mend it. The instinct to fix him was gone. A cold, crystalline clarity settled in my chest instead. "I'm going back to Valerie," he continued, tossing his ex-wife's name onto the counter like a winning lottery ticket. "I never stopped loving her. The last 18 years were a comfortable pause, but I am awake now. I am taking my life back." My jaw tightened. Valerie was the woman who had left him with mounting credit card bills and a broken lease 2 decades ago. I spent my 30s paying off her extravagant mistakes. Now he was welcoming her back into a home I paid for. While he spoke, my gaze drifted to his left wrist. Poking out from beneath his stiff white cuff was a new timepiece, a heavy silver dial chronometer. The metal caught the glare of the overhead pendant lights. I recognized the brand instantly. A $3,000 purchase made from our joint checking account just hours ago. A preemptive strike. He was already spending the wealth he assumed was his, decorating himself for a woman who had bled him dry in his 20s. My phone vibrated against the granite separating us. The screen illuminated with an automated text from my commercial lender. The preview read, "Notice, collateral deficit alert, Taylor Logistics, LLC." Richard glanced at the glowing screen, his brow furrowed, trying to read the text upside down. I reached out, swiped the notification away, and slid the device into my pocket. "Just spam," I said. My tone remained flat, unbothered. He bought it. He always bought the easiest explanation, because digging deeper required effort, and Richard despised effort. He preferred the illusion of control. "Leave your keys on the counter," he ordered, crossing his arms. I stood up, closing my laptop with a soft, definitive click. I reached into my purse, retrieved my key ring, and attached the heavy brass key to the front door. The metal felt warm against my palm. I pushed it across the cool stone surface. It scraped lightly, coming to rest an inch from his hand. People who demand the keys to the kingdom rarely comprehend the crushing weight of the crown. "Enjoy the house, Richard," I said, stepping past him into the hallway. I will be at the Marriott. I walked out the front door, leaving him alone in the quiet kitchen. He stood there, smirking, certain he had just won the war. He did not realize he had just locked himself inside a burning building. The Marriott hotel room smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and stale air conditioning. I dropped my leather overnight bag onto the luggage rack by the door. The heavy silence of the room wrapped around me, a sharp contrast to the life I had just walked away from. I walked over to the window and stared out at the sprawling grid of Overland Park streetlights. The amber glow mirrored another late night 15 years ago. That night felt identical to this one. It was a Tuesday in late autumn. Richard was pacing the hardwood floor of our starter home, his tie undone, his face slick with a cold sweat. He held a glass of scotch, the ice clinking violently against the crystal with every frantic step he took. He had invested our entire liquid savings into a guaranteed commercial real estate flip, spearheaded by a man he met on a golf course. Richard signed the contracts without reading the disclosure schedules. He only looked at the projected profit margins printed in bold at the top of the pitch deck. When the zoning permits failed and the primary lender called the loan due, Richard fractured. He stood in our living room, declaring his life was over. I did not yell. I did not throw plates or demand an explanation. I sat at our small dining table, pulled out my calculator, and opened the ledgers. For 6 hours, I traced the toxic debt. I liquidated my own early retirement accounts, paid the penalties, and negotiated a settlement with the developers to shield our remaining assets. I built a firewall around his mistake. Richard never learned how the engine worked. He never understood the mechanics of the rescue. He only knew that he woke up the next morning and the scary numbers were gone. From that day forward, a silent contract was forged. He got to play the fearless visionary, and I remained the invisible shield, protecting him from his own incompetence. I turned away from the hotel window. That shield was now permanently lowered. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress and pulled my laptop from my tote bag. The screen cast a pale blue light across my hands. Before I could figure out my next move, I needed to know exactly what resources I had available. I opened my web browser and navigated to the login portal for our joint wealth management accounts. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in the master password I had maintained for a decade. The screen buffered, loading a gray circle. Then a red banner flashed across the top. Invalid credentials. My pulse ticked in my throat. I retyped the password slower this time, ensuring every character was precise. I hit enter. Account locked. Password modified 2 hours prior. He had changed the locks on our digital life while I was driving to the hotel. Richard lacked the foresight to plan a complex financial heist on his own, but he was exceptionally good at following the advice of whatever shark he hired to represent him. I closed my eyes and took a slow, measured breath. I did not need the front door to access the house. I had built the architecture of our finances. I knew the back windows. I opened a separate tab and logged into a third-party accounting software I used to reconcile our ledgers for tax purposes. Because this software was registered under my separate corporate email, Richard did not know it existed. The dashboard populated, pulling live data from the banking API. I clicked on the primary joint holding account. The balance read 0. $250,000 of liquid cash was gone. I clicked the transaction history. The withdrawal had occurred at 4 p.m. A wire transfer routed out of the joint account and deposited into an external routing number. I ran a quick search on the destination routing prefix. It belonged to a private wealth branch in Delaware. I accessed the state corporate registry database and ran a query on the receiving account details hidden in the wire metadata. The screen loaded the registered entity. Valrich Holdings, LLC, formed exactly 12 days ago. The sheer audacity of the name made my chest tighten. Valerie and Richard. He had taken $250,000 of my earned capital and funneled it into a shell company bearing the name of the woman who used to run up his credit cards buying designer shoes. He stripped me of my cash flow, assuming he could starve me out of a legal fight. He wanted me panicked. He wanted me begging for a settlement to pay my grocery bills. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had saved months ago when the first quiet suspicions of his infidelity began to surface. Sarah Sterling answered on the second ring. Sarah was a partner at a boutique litigation firm in downtown Kansas City. She possessed a reputation that made opposing counsel settle out of court just to avoid sitting across from her at a deposition table. "Taylor," she answered, her voice smooth and alert despite the late hour. "Tell me the timer started." "He demanded the divorce tonight," I said, keeping my tone level. "He wants the house, the cars, and he asked for the keys." Before I left the kitchen, I heard the rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard on her end. Predictable. "Where are you sleeping?" "The Marriott on College Boulevard." "Good. Do not go back to the property." "What is the financial status?" I pulled the laptop closer to my chest. "He drained the joint accounts. $250,000 wired to a Delaware shell company named Val Rich Holdings. He locked me out of the primary portals." The typing on the other end of the line stopped. A heavy pause hung in the digital space between us. "He stole $250,000, Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave, adopting the cadence of a predator spotting a wounded animal. "That is a blatant violation of marital asset preservation. I can draft an emergency injunction by sunrise. We can freeze that Delaware account before he buys his girlfriend a single pair of earrings." I stared at the zero balance on my screen. The instinct to strike back to reclaim my stolen capital flared hot in my veins. It would be easy to let Sarah unleash hell on him tomorrow morning. But a frozen account would trigger a drawn-out battle. It would force Richard to play defensively. It would make him careful. "No," I said. "Do not file the injunction." Sarah exhaled a sharp breath. "Isabel, you have zero liquidity. How are you paying for the hotel room? How are you buying coffee tomorrow?" "I have a corporate travel card tied to a separate business account he does not know about," I replied. "It has a high enough limit to float me for a few months." "You are letting him walk away with the cash." "I am letting him think he successfully disarmed me," I corrected. The keyboard clacked once. A singular, deliberate strike. "Explain your angle, Taylor." "Richard is operating on pure arrogance," I said, watching the city lights flicker outside my window. "He thinks he caught me off guard. If we freeze his new account, we prove we are watching his every move. He will hire forensic accountants. He will scrutinize every asset we own. He will look under every rock. And if we let him keep the cash," Sarah finished the thought, the realization dawning in her tone, "he gets lazy." "Exactly. He gets sloppy. He is trying to fund a fantasy life with Valerie. Let him believe the money is his to burn. Let him believe he has the upper hand and I am too overwhelmed by the betrayal to fight back over the numbers." If a man is desperate to hang himself, Sarah, you do not snatch the rope out of his hands. You politely offer him a step stool. A low chuckle echoed through the receiver. It was a terrifying sound. "You are playing a very dangerous game of chess, Isabel. If he assumes he secured the liquid cash, what asset is he going to target next? He already told me he wants everything," I said, leaning back against the headboard. "Which means his lawyer is going to look at our portfolio and target the entity with the largest dollar sign attached to it." The line went silent as Sarah processed the implication. She knew exactly which asset carried the largest number. "Taylor Logistics," she whispered. "He is going to ask for the holding company." I closed the laptop, severing the glow of the screen, plunging the room into shadows. Yes, he is going to demand my business, and when he does, we are going to wrap it in a bow and hand it to him. Taylor Logistics, LLC, was a paper company. It held no employees, no inventory, and no tangible products. I created the corporate entity 5 years ago to handle the acquisition of commercial real estate. It served as a financial vessel, isolating risk from our personal portfolio. A month prior to Richard demanding the divorce, I located a highly lucrative industrial tract in Olathe, Kansas. The property possessed great potential for a regional distribution hub. To secure the land before competitors could bid, I negotiated a bridge loan with a private equity firm in Chicago. The terms were strict, but standard for rapid acquisitions. The lender approved the underwriting and wired $3 million into the primary operating account of Taylor Logistics. Richard discovered the deposit by accident. It happened on a Sunday morning. I left my laptop open on the kitchen island while pouring coffee. An automated email notification chimed on the screen. The subject line read, "Deposit confirmation available funds, $3 million." Richard walked past the island, stopped, and stared at the monitor. I watched his reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator. His eyes widened. A slow, calculated, greedy smile formed on his lips. Richard spent his career selling software packages to mid-level managers. He understood sales commissions and basic payroll. He lacked any functional comprehension of corporate finance leverage or debt-to-equity ratios. When he saw the notification, he did not see a highly regulated commercial loan tethered to an impending real estate transaction. He saw liquid profit. He believed I had secretly stockpiled $3 million in unallocated cash behind his back. That profound ignorance formed the foundation of his legal strategy. 2 days after I moved into the Marriott, I sat across from Sarah Sterling in her downtown office. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the Kansas City skyline. Sarah tossed a thick manila envelope onto her mahogany desk. The courier had delivered the package 20 minutes earlier. It was the official demand letter from the attorney Richard hired. "He wants it all," Sarah said, leaning back in her leather chair. She tapped a silver pen against the printed pages. "He is requesting sole ownership of the Overland Park residence. He wants both imported sedans, free and clear, and he is demanding 100% equity in Taylor Logistics." I picked up the document. The language was sharp and entitled. Richard claimed I had deliberately concealed marital assets, and he framed the demand for the corporate entity as rightful compensation for my alleged deceit. He painted himself as the victim of a financial conspiracy. He specifically cites the $3 million balance he believes resides in the corporate operating account. Sarah noted, her gaze narrowing. "He thinks he caught you hiding a fortune. He operates under the assumption that signing his name to that company will make him a millionaire overnight." I placed the letter back on the desk. My hands remained steady. The irony of his demand tasted bitter, but potent. What Richard did not know, and what he was too arrogant to investigate, was that the Olathe industrial deal fell through. The seller failed to clear an environmental inspection contingency, resulting in a breach of contract. Because the purchase collapsed, I was legally obligated to return the $3 million principal to the private equity firm in Chicago. I initiated the wire transfer a week before Richard demanded the divorce. The capital was gone. The operating account was virtually empty. However, returning the principal did not dissolve the corporate liability. The bridge loan contract contained rigid penalty clauses, early termination fees, and unresolved operational debts tied to the failed environmental survey. Taylor Logistics currently possessed 0 liquid assets and a heavy mountain of toxic financial obligations. "If Richard takes the company blindly," I told Sarah, tracing the edge of the mahogany desk, "he assumes the entirety of the corporate debt. He absorbs the penalties. He swallows the legal fees. He takes on a sinking ship, thinking it is a luxury yacht." Sarah smiled. It was a cold, calculating expression. Her legal mind was already mapping the battlefield. "We need him to sign a waiver of discovery," she said. "If his attorney audits the ledgers, they will see the empty accounts and the penalty clauses. We must ensure he is in such a frantic rush to claim the millions that he demands the company as is without looking under the hood." My phone rang, shattering the quiet of the office. The caller identification displayed the name of my adult son, Thomas. A sharp ache bloomed in my chest. Thomas was 24 years old, working his first real job as a junior architect in Denver. We spoke every Sunday. He rarely called in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. I answered the call, placing the phone to my ear. "Hello, Thomas." "Mom, what is going on?" His voice trembled, laced with confusion and a deep underlying hurt. "Dad just called me. He told me you two are getting a divorce. He said you have been hiding millions of dollars from him in secret corporate accounts. He said you tried to leave him with nothing." I closed my eyes. The character assassination had officially begun. Richard was not satisfied with stealing my immediate cash and forcing me out of my home. He needed to control the narrative. He needed our son to view him as the righteous victim and me as the calculating villain. Thomas continued his breathing ragged over the line. Dad says he is taking the business to secure his future because you locked him out of the family wealth. He told me he is buying Valerie a new house and taking her to Paris because he finally has the money he deserves. Mom, is it true? Did you hoard money away from us? The physical sensation of holding back the truth felt like swallowing ground glass. I wanted to tell my son everything. I wanted to explain the bridge loan, the empty accounts, the looming debt, and the delusional arrogance of his father. I wanted to scream that the man he idolized had stolen my savings and was currently trying to ruin my life for a woman who despised him 20 years ago. But Sarah raised her hand. She shook her head, offering a silent, stern warning. If I told Thomas the truth, Richard would eventually find out. The trap required Richard to remain in the dark. Revealing the financial reality to anyone risked leaking the secret to the very man we needed to remain blind. Your father and I are navigating a very complex legal separation, Thomas, I said, forcing my voice to project a calm, steady rhythm. I know this is difficult to hear. I know he is telling you his perspective, but I need you to trust me. The numbers he is quoting do not represent the whole story. Everything will make sense soon. A heavy pause settled over the line. I could hear the hum of city traffic outside his apartment in Denver. The silence stretched thick with unspoken doubt. Dad sounded so sure, Mom. He sounded like he won the lottery. Thomas sighed, a deep, defeated sound. I just want this to be peaceful. Please do not drag this out in court. Give him what he wants so everyone can move on. I promise you, Thomas, I said, my grip tightening around the phone. He is going to get exactly what he asked for. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the desk. The pain of hearing my son question my integrity burned in my throat. Richard had weaponized our child to feed his own ego. He was building his new life on a foundation of lies, constructing a fragile narrative where he emerged as the triumphant hero, rescuing himself from an oppressive wife. Sarah watched me, her expression softening into a rare display of empathy. He is using the boy to rattle you, she said softly. He wants you emotional. He wants you to react out of anger and correct the record. Let him rattle, I replied, opening my eyes to meet her gaze. Let him tell his friends and his family about the imaginary millions he is about to inherit. Let him brag to Valerie about the extravagant lifestyle he intends to provide. The higher he builds the pedestal, the harder the concrete will hit him when the foundation collapses. Sarah picked up her silver pen, spinning it between her fingers. We need to escalate this, she said. We need him to feel the pressure. If he thinks we are surrendering too easily, he might suspect a setup. We have to give him a fight to distract him from the real prize. I agreed. Richard thrived on conflict. He needed to feel like he was wresting control away from me by force. If I simply handed over the demand letter and signed the papers, his natural paranoia might kick in. We had to create a decoy. We had to direct his greedy attention toward a shiny object, allowing the rusted anchor of Taylor Logistics to remain hidden in the shadows. I stood up from the leather chair, smoothing the front of my blazer. I need to go back to the house, I said. Sarah frowned. The property is hostile territory right now, Isabel. He drained your checking account. He sent a demand letter for your entire portfolio. Going back there serves no tactical purpose. I have a lockbox in my home office, I explained. It contains the original formation documents for the LLC. If we are going to draft a waiver of discovery, we need the exact tax identification numbers and the original operating agreements. I am not waiting for a courier to retrieve them. Be careful, Sarah warned, turning back to her computer monitor. Do not engage him in conversation. Get the files and walk out. I left the law firm and rode the elevator down to the lobby. The afternoon sun baked the Kansas City pavement as I walked toward my rental car. I drove south toward Overland Park, the familiar route feeling foreign and strange. I was driving toward a home I paid for to retrieve my own documents from a man who was busy stealing my reputation. As I turned onto our tree-lined street, I prepared myself to face Richard. I mentally constructed a wall of indifference, ready to ignore his taunts and his smirks. I pulled into the driveway and parked behind his imported sedan. I walked up the stone pathway and inserted my spare key into the front door. I pushed it open, expecting to hear Richard barking orders on a phone call or watching a sports channel at maximum volume. Instead, I heard the soft melodic sound of a woman humming a pop song. I stepped into the foyer. The scent of an expensive floral perfume hung heavy in the conditioned air. It was a fragrance I knew well because I paid the credit card bill for it last week. I walked past the dining room and stepped into the main living area. Richard was not home, but Valerie was, and she was busy marking her new territory. Valerie stood in the center of the living room holding a silver tape measure. The afternoon light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the conditioned air. She wore a tailored white sundress and a pair of strappy leather sandals. Her blonde hair fell in soft, manicured waves over her shoulders. She looked exactly like a woman who had just claimed a prize she did not have to earn. She hummed an upbeat melody, extending the metal tape across the width of the glass panes. She was measuring my house for custom drapes. I stopped at the edge of the Persian rug. The soft thud of my low heels against the hardwood floor announced my arrival. Valerie froze. The metal tape measure snapped back into its plastic casing with a sharp, mechanical bite. She turned around. A momentary flash of guilt crossed her features, but it quickly morphed into a polished, haughty smile. "Hello, Isabel," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Richard did not mention you were coming by today." "I needed a few files from my office," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I did not realize you had already moved in." "Oh, I have not moved in yet," she said, waving a manicured hand through the air. "Just getting a head start on the renovations. This space is lovely, but it feels a bit dated. Richard and I want a fresh aesthetic for our new chapter. We are thinking floor-to-ceiling silk panels for these windows to bring in more natural warmth." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I merely shifted my gaze past her shoulder, looking out through the clear glass into the backyard. Beyond the patio, my prize-winning knockout roses climbed the custom wooden trellis. I had spent 4 spring seasons cultivating those bushes, carefully tending the soil and pruning the fragile stems. Now a thick, thorny, invasive vine crept up from the base of the planter. The parasitic weed coiled tight around the vibrant red blooms, choking the life from the host plant to feed its own rapid growth. It was a flawless mirror of the woman standing in front of me and the man who invited her inside. Valerie followed my line of sight, then turned back, crossing her arms over her chest. "Look, Isabel," she began, dropping the sweet facade, "we do not need to make this awkward. You had a good run. 18 years is a long time. But let us be honest with ourselves. You were a safe bet when he was getting on his feet. A stepping stone. He needed someone stable to help him build a foundation. Now he is successful. He has his empire, and he wants to share it with the person he was always meant to be with." The sheer entitlement of her words hung in the quiet room. She actually believed Richard built the wealth. She bought into the mythology he sold her. She saw the imported cars, the sprawling house, and the phantom corporate millions, assuming her high school sweetheart evolved into a financial titan. She did not know she was strapping herself to a sinking ship. "You are right, Valerie," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of friction. "He has built quite the empire." I turned away from her and walked toward the hallway leading to my home office. My path took me past the mahogany entryway table, where Richard usually dumped his keys and correspondence. A stack of sorted mail sat near a decorative ceramic bowl. An Architectural Digest magazine rested on top of the pile, slightly askew. Protruding from beneath the glossy cover was a thick ivory envelope. The return address caught my eye. It displayed the logo of a prominent secondary lending institution based in Chicago. My steps faltered. I paused next to the table. Richard never handled our primary mortgages. He certainly never engaged secondary lenders. I reached out, sliding the heavy envelope out from under the magazine. The seal was already broken. I unfolded the thick parchment paper inside. It was a final loan approval notice. The document detailed a second mortgage secured against the Overland Park house. The borrowed amount was staggering. It outlined a high-interest short-term line of credit designed for rapid cash extraction. I scanned the bottom of the page, searching for the authorization signatures. There was Richard's messy scrawl, and right beside it sat a pristine forgery of my own signature. A cold wave crashed over my ribs. My breathing slowed to a deliberate crawl. The puzzle pieces snapped into a terrifying, coherent picture. Richard did not just steal my liquid cash. He secretly leveraged the very roof over our heads. He engaged in felony wire fraud and identity theft to access hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Why would he take such a catastrophic risk? The answer hit me with the force of a physical blow. He needed immediate capital to fund his extravagant promises to Valerie. The Paris trips, the designer jewelry, the impending renovations. He drained our joint accounts, but it was not enough to sustain his new, reckless lifestyle. He took out the second mortgage, relying entirely on a singular delusion. He assumed the $3 million sitting in the Taylor Logistics account was pure profit. He believed he could sign the divorce decree, claim the holding company, and instantly pay off the forged mortgage before I ever discovered the deception. He was financially overextended, dangling over a bottomless cliff by a single thread of ignorance. If the LLC was empty, he had no way to service the debt. The bank would seize the house. I folded the paper precisely along its original creases and slipped it into the pocket of my blazer. The evidence of his crime sat heavy against my hip. This was no longer just a contentious divorce. This was a financial execution waiting to happen. I walked down the hall and entered my office. I unlocked the metal firebox under my desk, retrieving the original operating agreements and tax documents for Taylor Logistics. I slid the folders into my leather tote bag and walked back toward the foyer. Valerie was still standing by the windows, adjusting the metal tape measure. She looked over her shoulder, watching me prepare to leave. She wore a victorious smirk, assuming my silence equaled defeat. She thought I was retreating to lick my wounds while she claimed the castle. "Make sure you take all your personal items, Isabel," she called out. "We have a contractor coming next week to tear out the carpets. We are laying down imported Italian tile." I stopped with my hand resting on the front door handle. I looked around the foyer, taking in the vaulted ceilings, the crystal chandelier, and the sweeping staircase. I knew exactly what would happen when the first balloon payment on the second mortgage came due. I knew the foreclosure notices would arrive before the contractors ever finished laying the tile. "Enjoy the view, Valerie," I said, offering her a polite, measured smile. I walked out into the bright Kansas sunlight, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The lock clicked into place. I walked down the stone driveway toward my rental car, my mind operating at a dizzying speed. Richard was desperate. A desperate man in deep debt would do anything to get his hands on a perceived fortune. If we offered him Taylor Logistics too easily, his paranoia might override his greed. He might hire a forensic accountant to audit the LLC before he signed the final papers. If an auditor saw the empty operating account and the environmental penalties, Richard would panic. He would discover the trap. We needed a diversion. We had to create a fake battleground to distract him from his own impending ruin. I started the engine and dialed Sarah Sterling. She answered immediately. "I have the corporate documents," I told her, pulling out onto the suburban street. But the situation just escalated. He forged my signature on a second mortgage. He is drowning in secondary debt. Sarah let out a low whistle over the line. He is betting the house on the LLC payout. If we hand him the company, he goes bankrupt. "Yes," I replied, steering the car toward the highway. "But he is a cornered animal. If we surrender the company without a fight, he will smell a rat. We need to make him look the other way. We have to fight him over something else, something small enough to lose, but shiny enough to hold his attention." A red herring. Sarah murmured, the tactical gears turning in her head. "What do you have in mind?" I pressed the accelerator, merging onto the interstate. "I have an old offshore brokerage account," I said. It holds roughly $75,000. I have not touched it in years. Perfect, Sarah replied. We are going to make him bleed for those funds. By the time we are done, he will be so obsessed with winning that account, he will demand the LLC blindfolded. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown law firm, blurring the Kansas City skyline into a smear of gray concrete and bruised clouds. The low rumble of thunder reverberated through the thick glass, matching the steady drumming of my pulse. I sat across from Sarah Sterling, studying a single, crisp sheet of paper she had just slid across the polished mahogany desk. The document bore a fresh court stamp. It was a formal notice of substitution of counsel. Richard had fired his attorney. His original representation was a man named Gregory Hale, a meticulous veteran of family law who possessed a reputation for thorough, tedious audits. Hale was exactly the kind of lawyer you hired when you wanted to untangle 2 decades of shared marital assets with surgical precision. But surgical precision required patience, and patience was a luxury my husband no longer possessed. He terminated Hale yesterday afternoon, Sarah explained, leaning back in her leather chair and interlacing her fingers. I received a courtesy call from Gregory this morning. Off the record, of course. He advised Richard that claiming a corporate entity like Taylor Logistics without executing a comprehensive financial discovery process was tantamount to financial suicide. Gregory intended to subpoena your commercial bank records. He wanted a forensic accountant to review the business ledgers before allowing his client to sign a single settlement document. I kept my gaze fixed on the paper. If Hale had subpoenaed those records, the entire strategy would have disintegrated. An auditor would have instantly spotted the returned $3 million principal. They would have uncovered the toxic environmental penalty clauses and the operational debts dragging the holding company underwater. The illusion of my hidden wealth would have evaporated, leaving Richard face to face with the terrifying reality of his own impending bankruptcy. Why did he fire him, I asked, though the answer was already taking shape in my mind. Because Gregory demanded a timeline Richard could not afford, Sarah replied, her voice dropping into a low, tactical cadence. A forensic audit takes months. Your husband is currently holding a forged secondary mortgage that requires steep monthly service payments. He is bleeding cash to maintain the facade of a wealthy man for a woman who expects a luxury lifestyle. He cannot wait 3 months for a settlement. He needs the divorce finalized and the corporate operating accounts transferred to his name by the end of the month. I nodded, absorbing the sheer gravity of his desperation. Richard was trapped in a pressure cooker of his own design. He believed Taylor Logistics held the exact amount of capital required to erase his secret debts and fund his new reality. Any delay threatened to expose his fraud. He viewed Gregory Hale not as a legal protector, but as an obstacle standing between him and his phantom fortune. So who did he hire to replace him, I asked, sliding the document back across the desk. Sarah tapped a manicured fingernail against the printed name at the bottom of the page. Marcus Thorne. He is a high-volume litigator who advertises on highway billboards. Thorne does not care about the underlying health of an asset. He cares about closing the file, billing his contingent fee, and moving to the next case. He is a glorified expediter. He will do exactly what Richard tells him to do without asking the difficult questions. Richard isolated himself from competent legal protection. I murmured, the realization settling over me like a heavy blanket. He removed the only person capable of saving him from the trap. He removed his armor. Sarah agreed, but that makes him incredibly dangerous in the short term. A cornered, desperate man makes unpredictable choices. He is operating under the assumption that he has already won. Right on cue, my mobile phone illuminated on the armrest of my chair. A push notification appeared on the lock screen from a Premier Travel Rewards credit card we had opened a decade ago. I had removed myself as the primary guarantor years prior, transferring the liability solely to his name, but my contact information remained attached to the automated alert system. I picked up the device and read the text aloud. Charge approved. $22,400. Air France. first-class airfare to Charles de Gaulle Airport, and a reservation at the Ritz Paris. Sarah let out a slow, measured breath. He is spending the LLC money before the ink is even printed on the decree. He is treating the company ledger like a bottomless ATM, I said, staring at the digital numbers on my screen. He assumes the moment the judge stamps the final order, he can reimburse the credit cards, pay off the forged second mortgage, and walk away untouched. He is expanding his lifestyle exponentially, based on a ghost. The room grew quiet, save for the relentless driving rain striking the glass exterior. The stakes of the game we were playing suddenly felt suffocating. We were standing on the edge of a jagged precipice. Richard was plunging toward the bottom, pulling Valerie with him. But we were still tied to the same rope. "Isabel, listen to me carefully," Sarah said, leaning forward, resting her forearms on the desk. The tone of her voice commanded absolute focus. "We have a very narrow window to execute this maneuver. If Thorne accidentally does his job and files a standard request for production of documents, the House of Cards collapses. If Richard gets cold feet and asks for a simple balance sheet review, you are exposed." I met her sharp gaze, refusing to blink. "What happens if he looks? If he discovers Taylor Logistics is empty and burdened with toxic debt, he will immediately pivot," Sarah explained, her words clipping the air with brutal honesty. "He will abandon his demand for the holding company. He will target your legitimate retirement accounts. He will force the sale of the Overland Park house, leaving you responsible for half of the outstanding primary mortgage, while he attempts to bury his forged secondary loan in the chaos. He will bleed your true wealth dry to save his own skin. You will lose everything you spent 18 years building." A cold knot formed in my stomach. The margin for error was zero. We could not simply hope Richard remained blinded by his own greed. Hope was not a strategy. We had to actively blindfold him. We needed to orchestrate a diversion so loud and so compelling that he would never even glance in the direction of the corporate ledgers. "We need to launch the decoy," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "We need to cast the bait today." Sarah opened a secure drawer in her desk and extracted a slim manila folder. "I prepared the filings for the offshore brokerage account this morning," she said, opening the cover to reveal a stack of legal drafts. "The account holds exactly $75,000 in a conservative index fund. It is a minor asset in the grand scheme of your portfolio, but we are going to treat it like it holds the crown jewels." She handed me the first draft. It was a motion requesting an emergency protective order over the offshore funds. The language Sarah used was brilliant. It was frantic, protective, and highly defensive. It read like the desperate plea of a woman terrified of losing her secret stash of runaway money. "We are going to file this motion to block him from accessing the offshore account Sarah instructed, charting the psychological warfare. We are going to cite privacy concerns and jurisdictional hurdles. We are going to throw up every minor legal roadblock we can invent. And Marcus Thorne will read this motion and smell blood." I finished the thought, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "Exactly," Sarah said. "Thorne is a predator who chases movement. If we run, he will pursue. Richard already believes you are hiding capital. When he sees us fighting tooth and nail to protect this specific offshore account, his confirmation bias will take over. He will convince himself that this is where you buried the real treasure. He will direct Thorne to focus all their legal firepower on seizing this $75,000 decoy. And while they are spending thousands of dollars in billable hours fighting over a minor brokerage account," I said, tracing the signature line on the motion, "I will quietly prepare to hand them the keys to a $3 million graveyard." "Sign the affidavit," Sarah said, handing me a silver pen. "Let us give your husband a war he thinks he can win." I took the pen, pressing the ink against the paper with deliberate force. The trap was set. The bait was in the water. Now all we had to do was wait for the shark to bite. The digital ink on the emergency protective order barely dried before Marcus Thorne took the bait. Sarah filed the motion on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, Thorne submitted a blistering counterfiling demanding a full forensic trace of the offshore index fund. He accused me of funneling marital capital across international borders. He drafted the response with the frantic energy of a prospector striking gold. The account in question sat in a Cayman Islands registry. I opened it 12 years ago using a modest inheritance left by my late aunt. The initial deposit was $50,000. Over a decade of quiet market compounding, it grew to roughly $75,000. In the grand scope of my commercial real estate holdings, it was a rounding error. But Richard did not understand compound interest or diversified portfolios. He only understood the cinematic implication of a Caribbean routing number. To a man drowning in secret debts, an offshore account sounded like a buried treasure chest. To secure the trap, we requested a preliminary injunction hearing. Because the dockets were overflowing, the magistrate scheduled a virtual conference for the following Tuesday. I sat next to Sarah at the conference table in her Kansas City office. The laptop camera framed us perfectly. The screen split into 4 equal squares. The magistrate occupied the top left, wearing a black robe and an exhausted expression. Marcus Thorne sat in the bottom right, his desk cluttered with legal pads. Leaning so close to the webcam, his forehead dominated the frame. And then there was Richard. He sat beside Thorne wearing a tailored navy suit and a vibrant silk tie. He looked rested. He looked triumphant. The dark circles I remembered from his stressful sales quarters were gone, replaced by the arrogant glow of a man spending phantom millions. He held a ceramic coffee mug, taking slow, deliberate sips, projecting an aura of total control. The magistrate called the virtual room to order. Sarah launched the offensive. She played the role of a fiercely protective advocate, guarding her client from an invasive overreach. Your Honor, my client maintains a modest, separate inheritance, she argued, her voice tight with manufactured urgency. Mr. Taylor drained the primary joint checking account, leaving her with zero domestic liquidity. Now he seeks to invade a protected foreign index fund that predates his current financial misconduct. We request this specific asset be shielded from the general discovery pool. Thorne practically jumped out of his chair. He waved a printed copy of our motion at his webcam. Opposing counsel is attempting a classic sleight of hand. Your Honor, Thorne barked his volume, clipping the microphone audio. They are begging you to look away from a foreign tax haven. My client has every reason to believe Mrs. Taylor siphoned significant marital wealth into this offshore vehicle. We demand immediate, unrestricted access to those ledgers. We want every statement from the past 10 years. The magistrate sighed, rubbing his temples. He looked at my video feed. Mrs. Taylor, do you contest the assertion that marital funds were commingled in this account? This was my cue. The success of our entire strategy hinged on my performance in this exact moment. I needed Richard to believe he was watching me break. I needed him to see a woman backed into a corner, fighting for her last scrap of survival. I lowered my gaze, staring at my folded hands. I forced my breathing to turn shallow and erratic. I drew upon the very real exhaustion of the past 18 years, the late nights fixing his mistakes, the silent carrying of our financial burdens. I channeled that genuine fatigue and pushed it into my vocal cords. When I spoke, my voice trembled. That account is all I have left, I whispered, letting the audio feed capture the fragile tremor. He took the checking accounts. He took the house. That money was from my aunt. It is a separate safety net. Please do not let him touch it. I lifted my head, looking directly into the camera lens. I allowed a single authentic tear to pool in the corner of my eye and spill over my lash line. It tracked slowly down my cheek. I reached up and wiped it away with a shaking finger. On the screen, Richard leaned forward. The smug confidence radiating from his square vanished, replaced by a predatory hunger. His eyes locked onto my digital tears. In all our years of marriage, I had never cried over money. I was always the stoic architect, the calm pragmatist who solved the crisis. Seeing me visibly weep over a financial asset triggered a primal response in him. He believed he had found my weakness. He muted his microphone and turned to Thorne, whispering furiously. He pointed at the screen, tapping his finger against his desk. He was commanding his bulldog to attack the vulnerability. "Your Honor," Thorne interrupted, his tone dripping with newfound confidence. "The emotional distress of the petitioner only confirms our suspicions. There is a reason she is desperate to keep us out of the Cayman Registry. We formally request the court compel a full disclosure of the offshore asset." The magistrate, weary of the theatrics, issued a swift ruling. He ordered both parties to submit a comprehensive audit of the $75,000 account by the end of the week. He denied our request for a protective order. Thorne smiled, displaying a row of bright white teeth. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms, taking a long, victorious sip of his coffee. He looked at my video feed and offered a slow, deliberate nod. He thought he had just won the war. The magistrate ended the conference. The Zoom grid blinked out, plunging the laptop screen to black. The quiet of Sarah's office rushed back in. I reached for a tissue on the mahogany desk and dabbed the remaining moisture from my cheek. My hands stopped shaking. My breathing leveled out, returning to its natural, steady rhythm. The fragile, broken housewife vanished, leaving only the real estate consultant behind. Sarah closed her legal pad. A slow, wicked smile spread across her face. "Give the woman an Academy Award," she murmured. "He took the bait," I said, tossing the tissue into a wastebasket. "He swallowed it whole." Sarah turned to her computer, monitoring the incoming email traffic from opposing counsel. "Thorne is already sending discovery demands for the Cayman account." She noted her fingers flying across the keyboard. "He is demanding 10 years of transaction history. He wants foreign tax filings. He wants communication logs with the fund manager. He is preparing to bill Richard thousands of dollars in hourly fees to chase a shadow." "And Taylor Logistics?" I asked. "Not a single mention," Sarah confirmed. "They are entirely focused on the offshore prize. The holding company is not even on their radar." The diversion was working flawlessly. Richard and his bulldog attorney were about to spend the next 2 weeks tearing apart a minor index fund, analyzing every meaningless dividend and quarterly fee. They would be so consumed by the thrill of exposing my alleged offshore fortune that they would sign the final settlement papers without ever glancing at the domestic corporate ledgers. They were hunting mice, while a starved lion waited in their living room. I stood up from the conference table, feeling a profound sense of clarity. The board was set. The pieces were moving exactly as predicted. But as I gathered my coat, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller identification displayed Richard's personal number. He rarely called me directly anymore, preferring to communicate through his lawyers or by leaving passive-aggressive notes with our adult children. A direct call meant he was drunk on his courtroom victory and needed to gloat in real time. He needed to hear the defeat in my voice without the magistrate moderating the conversation. I answered the call, holding the phone to my ear. "What do you want, Richard?" "You thought you were so clever," he said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "You thought you could stash that money on an island and I would never find it. You always thought you were the smartest person in the room, Isabel." I kept my tone defeated, soft, and defensive. "You do not need that money. You have enough." "It is not about need," he countered, the arrogance vibrating through the receiver. "It is about taking what is mine. You kept secrets. Now you pay the price." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The silence stretched thick with his impending revelation. "Besides," he continued, "I need the cash. Valerie and I are expanding our portfolio. I just secured the deed to that commercial storefront on Main Street, the one she always wanted for her bakery." My grip on the phone tightened. "You bought her a commercial building?" "I finalized the purchase yesterday," he bragged. "It is a beautiful property. We are tearing down the interior walls next week. Once the divorce decree is signed and I take over the logistics company, we are doing a full custom remodel." I stared at Sarah, who was watching me with keen interest. I processed the timeline. Richard had 0 liquid capital. He had drained our joint checking. He had taken a forged secondary mortgage on the Overland Park house. He used the forged residential loan to buy a commercial storefront for his mistress. He tethered Valerie's entire business venture to the fraudulent debt. If the house went into foreclosure, the bakery went down with it. He was building her dream on top of a sinkhole. "I will see you at mediation, Isabel," he whispered. "Bring your checkbook." He ended the call. I lowered the phone, the dial tone humming, a flat, empty note. The scope of his ruin had just doubled. We were no longer just stripping him of his wealth. We were about to dismantle the very foundation of the fantasy he promised the woman who replaced me. The battle over the Cayman Islands registry stretched across 8 grueling days. For an entire week, Marcus Thorne buried us in aggressive legal paperwork. He filed emergency motions, demands for international tax records, and subpoenas for banking executives who operated 3 time zones away. Every single filing cost Richard hundreds of dollars in billable hours. I sat in my temporary office at the Marriott, drinking bitter hotel coffee, watching the legal fees mount on his side of the ledger. Richard was paying his bulldog attorney out of pocket. He was draining the very cash he had acquired through his forged residential loan. The financial vice was tightening around his neck with every passing hour. He needed capital to fund Valerie and her new commercial bakery, but he was setting his own resources on fire just to prove he could beat me in court. By the 9th morning, Sarah Sterling determined we had stretched the decoy to its absolute limit. If we prolonged the fight any further, Richard might run out of money to pay Thorne, resulting in another change of counsel. We needed him to win the skirmish before his wallet ran dry. I arrived at the law firm early. The sky over Kansas City hung low, holding the threat of an impending summer storm. Sarah sat at her desk reviewing the final concession draft. It was a formal stipulation agreement relinquishing my claim to the $75,000 offshore index fund. "We made him bleed for every penny," she noted, sliding the document across the polished wood. "Thorne billed him at least $15,000 this week, just to secure a fund worth 5 times that amount. The return on investment is terrible, but your husband is not playing a financial game anymore. He is playing an ego game." I picked up the silver pen. I did not hesitate. I signed my name, releasing the asset. The ink sank into the heavy paper, finalizing the illusion of my defeat. "Send it to Thorne," I instructed, placing the pen down. "Let him deliver the good news." We waited less than 2 hours. The response from opposing counsel arrived in Sarah's inbox with lightning speed. Thorne accepted the signed stipulation. He filed it with the court record, locking in the victory. Richard had officially seized the Cayman account. My phone vibrated a few minutes later. The caller identification displayed his personal number. I let it ring 3 times before pressing the answer button. I kept the device pressed against my ear, listening to the ambient noise on his end. I heard the distinct echo of footsteps on bare concrete. The acoustics suggested a large, empty room. "I told you I would find it," he said. His voice echoed slightly, bouncing off high ceilings. "You fought hard, Isabel. I will give you credit for that. But you always underestimate my resolve." I maintained a tight, subdued tone, projecting the exact flavor of bitterness he expected to hear. "You spent a fortune in legal fees just to spite me, Richard. It is the principle," he countered, "the arrogance, thick and unyielding. You tried to hide marital wealth. I corrected the imbalance. The funds are being routed to my domestic accounts tomorrow morning. You do not need that money," I said, repeating the script we had prepared. "I actually do need it," he replied, letting out a short, dismissive laugh. "I am standing in the middle of Valerie's new bakery right now. We have contractors arriving on Monday to tear out the drywall. Do you know how much a commercial kitchen ventilation system costs? The offshore money will cover the initial deposits for the general contractor." I closed my eyes, visualizing the trap tightening. Richard was using the seized offshore funds to pay contractors for a building he purchased with a forged residential mortgage. He was stacking toxic debt on top of fraudulent capital. But $75,000 would not sustain a commercial renovation for long. He was going to hit a liquidity wall within a matter of weeks. He knew it, too. Beneath the bragging, beneath the smug satisfaction of his temporary victory, I could hear the faint, frantic rhythm of a man running out of time. Which brings me to my next point, he continued, his footsteps halting. The echo faded, leaving only his sharp intake of breath. We are done playing these games. I am not spending another month negotiating over the leftover scraps. I want this divorce finalized by Friday. Friday, I repeated, letting a note of genuine surprise color my voice. That is, 3 days from now. Thorne is sending a formal request to expedite the remaining asset division Richard dictated, operating under the delusion that he held all the leverage. We are skipping the standard cooling-off periods. We are bypassing the remaining discovery window. We are going straight to a binding mediation session. I looked up at Sarah. She was monitoring the call, intercepting the audio through a secondary legal transcription device on her desk. She raised an eyebrow, a predatory gleam flashing in her dark eyes. Richard was doing exactly what we needed him to do. He was so desperate to secure the $3 million he believed lived inside Taylor Logistics that he was willing to waive his own legal protections to speed up the transfer. You cannot bypass discovery, I argued, pushing back just enough to make him fight for his own execution. There are protocols. We have to audit the remaining properties. We have to evaluate the corporate structures. I am not paying Thorne to sift through your meaningless spreadsheets. He snapped, his patience evaporating. I know what the Overland Park house is worth. I know what the cars are worth. And I know exactly what Taylor Logistics is holding. You are stalling because you do not want to hand over the company. He was begging to be destroyed. He was constructing the guillotine, sharpening the blade, and asking me to pull the lever. I will not sign a blind settlement. Richard I protested, maintaining the facade of a reluctant, protective business owner. The holding company is a complex entity. It is a bank account with a corporate logo. He shot back his ignorance on full display. Thorne is filing the paperwork for an expedited mediation today. If you refuse to sign, I will drag you back into open court and demand a full investigation into every single transaction you have made for the past 10 years. I will bleed you dry in legal fees, Isabel. Choose your battles. The line went dead. I lowered the phone and placed it softly on the mahogany desk. The silence in the office felt electric. Sarah refreshed her email inbox. A new message sat at the top of the queue, flagged with high importance. It was from Marcus Thorne. She opened the attachment. It was a formal petition for expedited binding mediation. Thorne had drafted a comprehensive waiver of financial discovery for all remaining marital assets. The language specifically named Taylor Logistics, exempting the corporate entity from any further audits, valuations, or liability reviews. Richard traded a $3 million audit for a $75,000 distraction. Sarah whispered, reading the glowing text on her monitor. He is so focused on the bakery and the offshore decoy that he just legally forfeited his right to look under the hood of the holding company. He is blinded by his own momentum, I replied, staring at the rain streaking down the exterior glass. He thinks he outsmarted us. He thinks he forced my hand. Sarah printed the petition. The laser printer hummed, spitting out the crisp pages. She stapled the corners and slid the packet across the desk. We agree to the expedited timeline, she instructed, her tone shifting into a sharp professional command. We meet them in the mediation boardroom on Friday. We let him bully you into transferring the LLC. We let him sign the waiver. I picked up the packet. The weight of the paper felt significant. It was the physical manifestation of 18 years of invisible labor coming to an end. For 2 decades, I had balanced his checkbooks, fixed his reckless investments, and protected him from the harsh realities of the financial market. I had been his safety net. Now I was stepping aside. Confirm the appointment, I said, handing the document back to her. Let us give my husband exactly what he is demanding. The mediation center occupied the top floor of a sterile glass high-rise in downtown Kansas City. The boardroom featured pale gray walls, a frosted glass door, and a long rectangular table made of cold, brushed steel. It smelled of bleached paper and the ozone generated by a laser printer humming in the corner. It was a space specifically designed to strip the emotion out of ruined marriages, leaving only the cold, hard arithmetic of asset division. I sat beside Sarah Sterling, keeping my hands folded in my lap. Across the steel table, Richard took his seat. He did not merely sit, he invaded the chair, leaning far back and draping his arm over the neighboring seat. Marcus Thorne, his bulldog attorney, sat next to him, unpacking thick legal folders with chaotic energy. The mediator was a retired appellate judge named David Caldwell. Caldwell possessed a quiet, measured demeanor earned through decades of settling bitter domestic disputes. He opened his leather portfolio and began reciting the standard opening disclosures outlining the rules of binding arbitration. Richard lasted exactly 2 minutes before interrupting. "We can skip the boilerplate," David Richard said, waving a dismissive hand. He used the mediator's first name, a calculated tactic designed to reduce the retired judge to the status of a subordinate employee. "We all know why we are here. I have a contractor waiting for a deposit this afternoon, and I am not spending my Friday listening to legal philosophy. Let us get to the numbers." Caldwell paused, his expression tightening a fraction of an inch. He looked at Sarah. Sarah offered a polite nod, granting the mediator permission to bypass the formalities. "Very well, Mr. Taylor Caldwell," said, folding his hands over his portfolio. "The petitioner has submitted a revised settlement structure. Based on the documents filed this morning, you are requesting sole ownership of the primary residence in Overland Park, both imported vehicles, and 100% equity in the corporate entity known as Taylor Logistics." "That is correct," Richard stated, his gaze locking onto mine. "And I want the corporate transfer expedited. I want the operating accounts routed to my primary banking profile by Tuesday morning." Caldwell adjusted his reading glasses, scanning the printed agenda. "The residential property and the vehicles are straightforward. However, Taylor Logistics is a commercial holding company. Standard procedure requires a comprehensive period of financial discovery. We must authorize an independent valuation audit, the corporate tax returns, and review the balance sheets before finalizing any transfer of ownership." "I do not need an audit," Richard snapped, leaning forward. "I know exactly what the company is holding." He was visualizing the $3 million deposit he had spied on my laptop screen a month ago. He was calculating how quickly he could wire those phantom funds to cover the forged secondary mortgage and pay the construction crew tearing apart Valerie's new bakery. The ticking clock in his head deafened him to the basic principles of due diligence. Sarah intervened, playing her role with flawless precision. She adopted a tone of strict, protective reluctance. "Mr. Caldwell, my client objects to bypassing the discovery phase for the holding company," Sarah said, her voice sharp and defensive. "Taylor Logistics is a complex financial vehicle. It requires careful unspooling. Transferring ownership without a formal ledger review is highly irregular, and we prefer to execute this separation by the book." I watched Richard's jaw tighten. His eyes narrowed. He interpreted Sarah's defense exactly the way we intended. He believed we were stalling. He assumed I was terrified of him taking control of the corporate accounts before I had a chance to siphon the imaginary millions into another offshore decoy. "She is stalling," David Richards said, pointing a finger across the table. "She just tried to hide a brokerage account in the Caribbean last week. Now she is trying to delay the transfer of the domestic business. I am not waiting 30 days for a phantom audit while she moves the capital." Thorne cleared his throat, sitting up straighter. "My client is willing to sign a formal waiver of financial discovery regarding Taylor Logistics," he announced, slapping a drafted document onto the steel table. "We waive our right to an independent valuation. We waive the ledger review. We demand the immediate execution of the ownership transfer today." Caldwell looked at Thorne, his gray eyebrows raising in genuine surprise. "Counselor, you are advising your client to blindly acquire a commercial entity without verifying its liabilities. That is a highly unorthodox legal strategy." "It is a necessary strategy to prevent further asset concealment," Thorne countered, parroting the narrative Richard had fed him. I kept my eyes fixed on the brushed steel surface. I remembered the early years of our marriage when Richard insisted on buying a used sports car from a roadside dealership. He fell in love with the glossy red paint and the leather seats. The salesman offered a rapid financing contract. I begged Richard to let a mechanic inspect the engine before signing the loan. He refused, accusing me of trying to ruin his dream. He signed the paperwork that same afternoon. The transmission failed 3 weeks later, stranding us on a highway and plunging us into debt. He had not changed. He was still the same impatient, greedy man, refusing to look beneath the glossy surface. Sarah leaned forward, pressing her palms against the table. If opposing counsel insists on this reckless course of action, I want a formal warning entered into the binding record, she declared. The room fell silent. Speak your piece, Counselor Caldwell instructed, activating a small digital audio recorder near his portfolio. Sarah looked directly at Richard. Her gaze was piercing cold and unyielding. Mr. Taylor, you are demanding the immediate transfer of Taylor Logistics, LLC, without conducting a financial review. You must understand that by doing so, you are accepting this corporate entity as is. You are assuming 100% of the risk. You are inheriting every encumbrance, every penalty clause, every operational debt, and every toxic liability associated with that company. If you sign this waiver, you cannot return to this table and claim ignorance. You own the consequences. Richard scoffed. He actually laughed, a short, harsh sound that echoed off the frosted glass door. Stop trying to scare me, Sarah, he sneered. I know what the company is worth. You are just bitter that I found the vault before you could empty it. Mr. Thorne Caldwell said, addressing the Bulldog attorney, does your client comprehend the magnitude of this waiver? Thorne hesitated. For a split second, the raw legal danger of the situation pierced through his desire to collect a fast contingency fee. He looked at Sarah, then at Richard. Richard glared at him, a silent command to finish the job. My client understands the risks, Thorne mumbled, sliding the document toward the center of the table. That is not sufficient for my client, Sarah interrupted, her voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. If we are bypassing a state-mandated discovery period, I require a formal hold harmless agreement. I want it drafted right now. I want it explicitly stated that Mr. Taylor indemnifies my client from any and all financial fallout resulting from his acquisition of Taylor Logistics. He absorbs the debts, and he holds her harmless forever. Richard slammed his hand flat against the steel. Draft it, Marcus, he barked. Richard, I advise we take a brief recess, Thorne whispered, trying to salvage a shred of professional dignity. A hold harmless clause on an unverified asset is permanent. Draft the paper, Marcus. Richard hissed, his face flushing with impatient rage. She is playing games. She wants me to second-guess the prize. I am not falling for it. Type it up and let me sign it so I can get out of this miserable room. Thorne surrendered. He opened his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard to draft the most lethal legal document of Richard's life. The printer in the corner hummed to life a few minutes later, spitting out a single sheet of paper. Thorne retrieved the page and placed it in front of Richard. Caldwell handed over a heavy black fountain pen. Take a moment to read it, Mr. Taylor, Caldwell advised. Richard did not read a single word. He grabbed the pen, pressing the nib into the paper with such force it nearly tore the parchment. He signed his full legal name, sealing the trap with his own hand. He tossed the pen onto the table and leaned back, flashing that same arrogant smirk he wore the night he demanded my house keys. Done, he announced. The company is mine. I looked at the fresh ink drying on the page. A profound quiet settled over my mind. He had just demanded the anchor chained it to his own ankle and happily tossed himself overboard. The mediation concluded, setting the stage for the final courtroom decree where the transfer would become permanent. He thought he had outmaneuvered me. He had no idea the water he was stepping into possessed no bottom. The weekend before the final court date stretched out like a drawn breath. I rented a small timber frame cabin near the shores of Clinton Lake, hoping the isolation would grant me a few days of quiet before the storm broke. The property sat at the end of a long gravel driveway surrounded by towering oak trees and overgrown brush. Saturday morning arrived crisp and damp. The air held the sharp scent of wet pine needles and cold lake water. I stepped out onto the back porch, wearing thick canvas gardening gloves and carrying a pair of steel pruning shears I found in the outdoor shed. Next to the wooden steps, a sprawling lilac bush had grown wild and unkempt. Dead, woody stems choked the interior of the plant, blocking the sunlight from reaching the healthy green shoots struggling to survive near the base. I gripped the handles of the shears and went to work. I positioned the sharp steel blades around a thick, brittle branch and squeezed. The wood snapped with a satisfying crack. I pulled the dead weight free and tossed it onto the damp grass. I repeated the motion, severing another lifeless limb, then another. For 18 years, I had operated as a human trellis. I spent my youth propping up a man who refused to grow on his own. I watered his ambitions with my own capital. I shielded his fragile ego from the harsh weather of his own bad decisions. Now, I was holding the shears. The physical act of cutting away the decay felt intoxicating. With every snap of the blades, I severed a piece of the guilt society conditions women to feel when they stop fixing broken men. I was no longer the caretaker of his mistakes. My phone vibrated against the wooden planks of the porch table, disrupting the rhythm of my work. I pulled off my right glove and picked up the device. The caller identification displayed his name. I pressed the green button and held the speaker to my ear. "Good morning, Isabel," Richard said. His tone was jarring. The bitter defensive hostility he carried during the mediation session was gone. In its place was a smooth, expansive warmth. It was the specific, false magnanimity of a victor surveying the conquered territory. He had signed the hold harmless agreement. He believed the holding company and its phantom fortune were legally secured, waiting only for the judge's final stamp on Tuesday morning. "Good morning, Richard," I replied, keeping my voice hollow and polite. "I'm calling to discuss the remaining household items," he continued, his words flowing with a practiced, casual rhythm. "I know we initially fought over the antique dining set and the artwork in the foyer. I have decided to let you keep them. You can hire a moving company to collect them next week. I do not want to argue over furniture anymore. We should both move on with our lives." He was offering me scraps from my own dining room and framing it as an act of profound generosity. He wanted to feel like a benevolent king sparing a peasant. He needed to prove he was above the petty squabbles of a standard divorce because he perceived himself to be a newly minted millionaire. "That is very generous of you," I said, staring at a severed branch on the grass. "Well, we have a lot to celebrate," he boasted, unable to contain his pride for another second. He needed an audience. "Valerie and I are finalizing our itinerary. I just secured 2 first-class tickets on Air France for Thursday evening. We are spending 10 days in the 8th arrondissement. I gripped the edge of the wooden porch rail. The rough timber pressed into my bare palm, leaving deep indentations in my skin. "You booked the flights already?" "Of course I did," he laughed, a light, airy sound. "The premium seats were selling out. I put the flights and the hotel deposit on the Platinum travel card. I maxed out the limit, but it does not matter. The LLC transfer executes on Tuesday. I will pay off the entire credit balance by Wednesday afternoon. It is just a temporary float." He was digging his grave with a golden shovel. He was charging tens of thousands of dollars to high-interest credit cards, operating on the delusion that a corporate bank account held his salvation. Every swipe of plastic dug him deeper into an inescapable financial pit. He was tethering his romantic fantasy to a company burdened by environmental penalties and toxic commercial debt. "Paris is beautiful this time of year," I murmured, ensuring no trace of sarcasm leaked into the audio feed. "It is a new beginning," he declared. "I hope you find your footing, Isabel. I really do. You will figure it out eventually." "I will manage," I said. "See you in court on Tuesday," he concluded, the line clicking dead. I set the phone down and picked up my canvas glove. The quiet of the lake returned, but the air felt charged, thick with the static electricity that precedes a lightning strike. The trap was fully constructed. The bait was swallowed. The waiver was signed. The only thing remaining was the final execution. The next 48 hours moved at an agonizing crawl. Sunday bled into Monday. I spent the time walking the dirt trails around the lake, watching the gray water ripple against the rocky shoreline. I thought about the woman I was in my 20s, sitting at a dining table with a calculator, desperately trying to save a man from his own incompetence. That woman felt like a stranger now. She traded her peace for his comfort. The woman walking the trails possessed no desire to save anyone but herself. Every minute that ticked by represented another fraction of Richard's impending ruin. I imagined Valerie in the Overland Park house packing designer luggage she could not afford. I pictured Richard reviewing high-end restaurant menus for a vacation he would never take. They were living inside a fragile soap bubble, marveling at the iridescent colors, completely unaware of the needle hovering just inches away. Tuesday morning broke with a pale, thin light filtering through the heavy curtains of my Marriott hotel room. I had driven back to the city late Monday night, leaving the quiet of the cabin behind. Today required noise. Today required armor. I stood in front of the full-length mirror, studying my reflection. I did not look like a victim of betrayal. I looked like a woman preparing to close a highly lucrative corporate merger. I reached into the closet and pulled out a sharp, tailored navy blue suit. The fabric felt heavy and substantial against my skin. I slipped my arms into the blazer, fastening the single dark button at the waist. I smoothed the stiff lapels. The deep blue hue starkly contrasted with the sterile gray walls of the hotel room. I stepped into a pair of sleek black heels, the sharp click of the leather soles echoing on the bathroom tile. I applied my makeup with practiced precision, focusing on clean lines and a neutral palette. No dramatic shades, no visual signs of distress. My physical appearance needed to project unshakable stability. Richard would walk into the courthouse expecting to see a defeated ex-wife handing over the keys to a kingdom. I needed him to see a stone wall. I placed my phone, my car keys, and a single, thick leather folio into my structured handbag. The folio contained the unvarnished, unredacted ledgers for Taylor Logistics. It held the environmental penalty notices, the bridge loan return receipts, and the negative balance sheets. It held the inescapable truth. I walked toward the door, the strap of the handbag resting securely on my shoulder. I reached for the brass handle, pausing for one final second. The air in the hallway felt remarkably still. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the stale, conditioned air of the hotel. When I exhaled, the last remaining shred of my broken marriage left my body. I pulled the heavy door open and stepped out into the brightly lit corridor. The war was over. It was time to sign the treaty and let the casualties fall where they may. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung shut, sealing us inside a space where futures were routinely dismantled. The Johnson County Courthouse possessed a specific atmosphere. The air felt thick and stale, smelling faintly of floor wax, aged paper, and quiet desperation. It was a room designed to intimidate, forcing civilians to recognize the severe authority of the state. I walked down the center aisle, my black heels clicking a steady, rhythmic tempo against the polished marble floor. Sarah Sterling walked beside me, carrying a single, slim leather folio. We bypassed the gallery seating and took our places at the petitioner's table on the left side of the room. The wooden chairs scraped harshly against the floor as we sat. Across the center aisle, Richard was already seated at the respondent's table. He did not look like a man arriving to finalize the death of an 18-year marriage. He looked like a corporate raider attending a victory banquet. He wore a crisp silver tie that perfectly matched the $3,000 chronometer resting on his left wrist. His posture radiated an arrogant, casual energy. He leaned back in his chair, whispering to the person seated directly behind him in the front row of the gallery. Valerie had decided to attend. Family court proceedings generally discouraged the presence of new romantic partners during final settlement signings, but Valerie operated under a profound sense of entitlement. She wore a tailored ivory dress adorned with a silk scarf tied delicately around her neck. She looked expensive. I recognized the designer label on her handbag. It was a recent purchase, likely funded by the high-interest credit cards Richard was currently maxing out. 2 decades ago, she abandoned him because he could not provide this exact level of luxury. Now she sat leaning over the wooden partition, her hand resting possessively on Richard's shoulder, believing she had finally backed the winning horse. Next, to Richard Marcus Thorne hastily unpacked a battered leather briefcase. The bulldog attorney pulled out uneven stacks of legal pads and manila folders, spreading them across the table in a chaotic array. Thorne checked his smartphone every few seconds. He was not focused on his client's long-term legal safety. He was calculating how quickly he could deposit his contingency fee. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open. The bailiff instructed the room to rise. Judge Harrison stepped up to the elevated platform. He was a stern man in his late 60s with sharp features and a shock of white hair. He carried a towering stack of settlement documents, dropping them onto his desk with a heavy, resounding thud. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom, a physical reminder of the gravity of the morning. Harrison took his seat, adjusting his black robe. He put on a pair of silver wire-rimmed reading glasses and peered down at the paperwork. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not engage in small talk. He simply opened the first folder and began reading. The silence in the room stretched taut. The only sound was the low hum of the central air conditioning system and the crisp turn of parchment pages. For the first 10 minutes, Harrison methodically reviewed the standard divisions. He confirmed the transfer of the Overland Park residence. He validated the division of the vehicles. He noted the $75,000 Cayman Islands account Richard had fought so desperately to claim. Thorne puffed his chest out slightly when the judge read that specific line item, radiating pride over his tactical diversion. I kept my hands folded on the table. I focused my gaze on the grain of the wood directly in front of me. I slowed my breathing, measuring the inhales and exhales. Then the steady rhythm of turning pages stopped. Judge Harrison paused at page 34. He read the text, his brow furrowed, forming a deep crease above his silver glasses. He read the paragraph a second time. The silence in the room shifted, growing heavy and expectant. Richard checked his watch, tapping his polished leather shoe against the marble floor. He had a flight to Paris on Thursday and a demolition crew scheduled for Valerie's Bakery on Monday. He possessed no patience for legal caution. Judge Harrison slowly removed his reading glasses. He folded the earpieces and placed the frames deliberately on top of the open folder. He looked down from the bench, bypassing the attorneys and fixing his stern gaze directly on my husband. Mr. Taylor, against the advice of this court, you are waiving your right to financial discovery regarding the commercial entity listed as Taylor Logistics. Do you understand what you are doing? The words hung in the sterile air, identical to the memory I replayed in my mind 1,000 times. Richard did not hesitate. He did not consult his attorney. He merely adjusted the lapels of his charcoal suit and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Yes, Your Honor, he stated, his voice projecting a supreme, unearned confidence. Harrison did not look away. The judge possessed decades of experience watching greedy individuals step into bear traps they set for themselves. He offered one final lifeline. I want the record to be explicitly clear. Harrison continued his tone, dropping into a severe warning cadence. This settlement includes a permanent hold harmless clause. You are requesting the immediate transfer of a corporate holding company without conducting an independent valuation, without reviewing the tax ledgers, and without an audit of the operating accounts. If there are hidden liabilities, tax liens, or structural debts attached to this company, you are assuming sole responsibility for them. You cannot return to this court and claim fraud or ignorance. You will own the consequences of this waiver. Are you certain you wish to proceed under these parameters? Valerie leaned over the wooden partition, whispering urgently into Richard's ear. Tell him yes, she hissed, her voice carrying just enough to reach my table. We have the contractor waiting. Richard waved her away without looking back. He smiled a slow, condescending smirk that signaled his belief that he was the smartest person in the room. He looked at me, his eyes flashing with victorious malice. He believed I was sitting there, terrified, holding my breath, praying the judge would stop the transfer and save my hidden millions. I know exactly what the business is worth, Your Honor, Richard declared. My ex-wife is simply upset that she has to hand over the keys. I accept the liability. Let us finalize the decree." Harrison stared at him for 3 long seconds. The judge recognized arrogance when he saw it, and he held no sympathy for a man demanding his own execution. "Very well," Harrison said, picking up his glasses and slipping them back onto his face. "The court accepts the waiver." The bailiff stepped forward, collecting the signature pages from the bench and bringing them to our tables. Sarah received the packet first. She reviewed the final clauses, tracing the text with her silver pen. She slid the document toward me, pointing to the yellow highlighted lines requiring my authorization. I picked up the pen. The metal felt cool and heavy against my fingers. I looked down at the paper, transferring ownership of Taylor Logistics to Richard. I thought about the bridge loan. I thought about the returned principal, the toxic environmental penalties, and the fraudulent secondary mortgage Richard tied to Valerie's commercial storefront. I thought about the 18 years I spent carrying the weight of his incompetence. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. My hand did not shake. The signature flowed smooth and decisive. The bailiff retrieved the packet and carried it across the aisle to Richard. My husband snatched the pen from Thorne's hand and scrawled his signature across the line with aggressive, theatrical flair. He pushed the paper back to the bailiff, blowing out a long breath. The documents were returned to the bench. Judge Harrison reviewed the ink, ensuring all parties had properly executed the agreement. He picked up a heavy wooden stamp from his desk. He pressed it onto an ink pad and brought it down hard on the cover page. The loud crack of the stamp echoed through the room. "The decree is finalized," Harrison announced, closing the thick folder. "The marital assets are formally dissolved and redistributed according to the signed stipulation. The court is adjourned." Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaling a deep breath of pure satisfaction. He looked like a king taking his throne, a sovereign claiming his rightful empire. He turned around and grabbed Valerie's hand, squeezing it tight. They shared a bright, triumphant smile, already spending the phantom fortune in their minds. Sarah Sterling quietly closed her leather folio. She turned her head slightly, catching my eye. A dangerous, predatory calm settled over her features. The trap was locked. The waiver was ironclad. Now it was time to show him the cage. The echo of the wooden stamp lingered in the stale courtroom air, a heavy final note concluding 18 years of marital history. Judge Harrison closed the thick manila folder. He began gathering his reading glasses and his personal notes, preparing to step down from the elevated bench. The legal proceeding was technically over. The assets were divided. The decree was a matter of public record. But Marcus Thorne was not interested in the procedural conclusion. The bulldog attorney was driven by a much more primal motivation. He wanted his contingency fee. Thorne did not even wait for the judge to exit the room. He reached into his battered leather briefcase and retrieved a sleek silver tablet. He powered the device on, the screen illuminating his eager face with a pale blue glow. He tapped the glass surface, navigating to a secure financial transfer portal. "We need the routing numbers," Thorne announced, his voice echoing across the center aisle. He did not look at me. He directed his demand solely at Sarah Sterling. "My client is the sole proprietor of Taylor Logistics as of 30 seconds ago. We are initiating the primary capital transfer to his personal accounts right now. I want the digital keys." Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. He shot me a final parting glance. It was a look of pure, unadulterated pity. He thought he had gutted me. He believed I was sitting there mourning the loss of a vast corporate fortune, watching my life savings slip through my fingers. In his mind, he was already packing his bags for the Ritz Paris, while I prepared to move into a cheap apartment. Sarah Sterling did not flinch. She reached into her leather folio. She extracted a single sheet of heavy stock paper. It contained the exact routing details, the primary operating account numbers, and the digital authorization codes for the holding company. She held the paper loosely between her index and middle fingers. She extended her arm, sliding the sheet across the polished surface of the petitioner's table. The bailiff intercepted the document, bridging the gap across the aisle and handing it directly to Thorne. "Thank you," Thorne muttered, snatching the paper. The courtroom fell into a deep, expectant silence. The only sound remaining was the rapid, frantic tapping of Thorne's plastic stylus against the glass screen of his tablet. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I did not look at Richard. I watched Thorne. I watched the specific mechanics of greed operating in real time. The attorney typed the 9-digit routing number. He verified the sequence. He entered the 12-digit operating account number. He input the authorization credentials. He tapped the submit button. A small circular loading icon appeared on his screen, spinning in a continuous loop. In the front row of the gallery, Valerie leaned forward. She rested her chin on her hands, her eyes fixed on the back of Richard's head. She was practically vibrating with anticipation. She was waiting for the verbal confirmation, waiting for Thorne to announce that the millions were secured so she could finalize the contractor's deposit for her new commercial bakery. The loading icon stopped spinning. The screen refreshed. Thorne narrowed his eyes. He blinked, leaning closer to the tablet. The pale blue light reflecting off his face shifted to a stark, cautionary yellow. He tapped the screen again, pressing the stylus harder against the glass. "Must be the cellular reception in this building," Thorne muttered, a note of irritation creeping into his voice. "The firewall is blocking the verification ping." He closed the browser application. He opened a direct banking application bypassing the third-party portal. He referenced the printed sheet of paper again, retyping the long string of numbers with deliberate, exaggerated care. He checked every single digit twice. He hit enter. The circular icon spun for 3 seconds. Then it vanished. The yellow light reflecting on Thorne's face turned a harsh, blinding red. The attorney froze. His breathing stopped. The confident, chaotic energy that defined his entire courtroom presence evaporated in an instant. He stared at the screen, reading the text displayed inside the crimson banner. He read it once. He read it a second time. His jaw slackened. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. "What is the holdup?" Marcus Richard asked, his tone laced with impatient annoyance. He uncrossed his legs, leaning over to look at the tablet. "Just run the transfer." Thorne did not answer. He could not form the words. He slowly turned his head, looking at Richard with an expression of profound professional terror. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet room. Richard snatched the tablet from his attorney's hands. He stared at the screen. The silence in the room stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. I watched the exact moment my husband's fantasy collided with reality. It did not happen gradually. It happened all at once. The arrogant flush in his cheeks faded. The smug tilt of his lips collapsed. The confident posture of the victorious king crumbled, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. "What is this?" Richard whispered, the words slipping out of his mouth, a raspy, breathless sound. He tapped the screen. He swiped his finger across the glass, trying to clear the notification. The red banner remained fixed in place. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice rising, cracking under the sudden immense weight of panic. He glared at Thorne. "Fix this." "You entered the wrong sequence." "I entered the numbers perfectly," Thorne replied, his voice shaking. "The portal is live." "The account is empty, Richard." The word echoed off the oak panels. Empty. Richard stood up. He moved so fast his heavy wooden chair tipped backward, crashing onto the marble floor with a deafening crack. The sound startled everyone in the room. Valerie gasped, jumping in her seat. Judge Harrison, who had just reached the edge of the elevated platform, stopped in his tracks. He turned around, his dark robe swirling around his ankles. His face hardened into a mask of severe judicial fury. "She stole it," Richard roared, pointing a trembling finger across the aisle directly at my face. "She drained the accounts. She committed wire fraud. The money was there a month ago. I saw the deposit. $3 million. She hid it." His voice echoed, bouncing off the high ceilings, a frantic, animalistic shout. He was losing his mind in real time. The Paris tickets, the designer handbags, the forged residential mortgage, the commercial bakery, All of it rested on a foundation that had just vanished into thin air. He was drowning, and he was thrashing wildly, searching for someone to blame. "Mr. Taylor, you will lower your voice and restrain yourself immediately," Judge Harrison commanded, his voice booming through the courtroom, carrying the full weight of legal authority. "One more outburst, and I will hold you in contempt. Sit down." "I am not sitting down," Richard shouted, spittle flying from his lips. His face flushed a dark, dangerous purple. "She committed a felony. I demand an immediate investigation. I want her arrested. She emptied the corporate vault before she signed the decree." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with the man who had spent 18 years taking my labor for granted. I remained seated, my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly on the table. I felt a profound, icy peace settling over my chest. The math was finally balanced. Sarah Sterling stood up. She did not rush. She moved with the fluid, graceful precision of a predator closing the final distance on its prey. She reached into her leather tote bag and extracted her own laptop. She opened the aluminum lid, booting the machine from sleep mode. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice smooth, calm, and entirely unbothered by the screaming man across the aisle. "My client did not hide a single penny. She did not commit wire fraud, and she certainly did not empty a vault." Sarah turned the laptop around facing the center aisle, allowing both Richard and Judge Harrison a clear, unobstructed view of the display. The screen glowed bright red, displaying the internal administrative dashboard for Taylor Logistics, LLC. In the center of the screen, a large, bold notification blared in stark white text against the crimson background. "Routing error. Account frozen due to default." Richard stared at the glowing letters, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with uncomprehending horror. He looked from the screen to Sarah, then to me. The reality of his situation was too vast, too catastrophic for his mind to process all at once. "That money was profit," Richard stammered, his voice dropping to a desperate, confused whisper. "I saw the deposit. $3 million. Sarah placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "That is where you are mistaken, Mr. Taylor." Sarah delivered the final, fatal blow, her words striking the quiet room like a gavel. The $3 million was not profit. It was a highly leveraged commercial bridge loan. My client returned the principal to the lender weeks ago when a real estate acquisition fell through. The company is currently carrying 0 liquid assets and substantial environmental penalty debts. You waived your right to discover this fact. You demanded sole ownership of the entity. You signed a permanent hold harmless agreement. Sarah paused, letting the silence stretch, amplifying the impact of the final sentence. "My client did not steal a fortune," she concluded, her gaze piercing through his shattered defense. "You just legally acquired a $3 million anchor, and you tied it around your own neck." The courtroom felt like a vacuum. The air rushed out, leaving a cold, suffocating silence in its wake. The crimson glow from the laptop screen painted a harsh shadow across my ex-husband's face. He stood frozen. His mouth hung slightly open, but no sound emerged. The arrogant facade he wore for 18 years cracked and shattered, splintering into 1,000 irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. Sarah Sterling did not let the silence linger. She tapped a key on her laptop, bringing up the itemized ledger for Taylor Logistics. The screen displayed lines of red text indicating severe deficit balances. "Let me break down the corporate structure for opposing counsel," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear, carrying effortlessly to the judge's bench. "The entity in question does not hold liquid capital. A month ago, my client secured a commercial bridge loan from a private equity firm in Chicago. The funds were intended for an industrial property acquisition in Olathe. The $3 million deposit Mr. Taylor witnessed was not profit. It was highly leveraged, borrowed money." Richard stared at her, his chest rising and falling in rapid, erratic bursts. He grabbed the edge of the wooden table, his knuckles turning a stark bone white. He was a salesman who spent his entire career chasing the initial commission check while ignoring the fulfillment logistics. He never bothered to read the fine print. He operated on surface-level assumptions, and that lifelong habit had just led him into a fatal trap. When the environmental inspection failed, the purchase agreement collapsed. Sarah continued navigating to the next page of the digital ledger. My client was contractually obligated to return the principal to the lender. She executed that transfer weeks before these divorce proceedings began. The vault is empty because the money never belonged to her in the first place. Marcus Thorne sank lower into his chair. The bulldog attorney looked like he wanted the polished marble floor to open up and swallow him whole. He realized he had just facilitated the worst legal blunder of his career. But returning the funds did not erase the corporate footprint Sarah added, turning her attention directly to Richard. The bridge loan carried strict operational covenants. When the deal fell through, the holding company incurred severe early termination fees. Furthermore, the failed environmental survey triggered compliance penalties. The LLC holds broken vendor contracts and toxic liabilities. It is a shell company operating deeply underwater. Richard shook his head, his silver ties swaying with the frantic motion. "No," he stammered, a thick layer of denial coating his words. "You are lying. You fabricated these ledgers to hide the cash. I know what I saw." Judge Harrison picked up his gavel, tapping the wooden block once to command the room. The sharp crack cut through Richard's rising panic. "There is no fabrication, Mr. Taylor," the judge stated, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "The court received the verified financial affidavits from the private equity firm this morning. The ledgers are accurate. You chose to bypass the discovery phase. You explicitly refused an independent audit." Richard turned his desperate gaze toward the bench. "Your Honor, you have to reverse the transfer," he pleaded, the arrogance replaced by raw begging. "She set me up. I cannot take on that kind of debt. You have to void the waiver." Harrison flipped open the settlement folder resting on his desk. He located the specific page containing the hold harmless agreement. He smoothed the paper flat, reading the text with slow, deliberate pronunciation. "The petitioner assumes all liabilities associated with Taylor Logistics, LLC," the judge read aloud. "The petitioner holds the respondent harmless from any and all financial fallout, past, present, and future." You drafted this clause, Mr. Taylor. Your counsel submitted it to this court. I warned you on the record about the dangers of acquiring an unverified commercial entity. You looked me in the eye and demanded the transfer. The decree is ironclad. I will not reverse a legal settlement simply because you failed to do your homework. Richard stumbled backward, his calves hitting the seat of his chair. He collapsed into the wooden frame, the fight draining from his muscles. The magnitude of his ruin was taking shape, but he had not yet seen the full picture. He only knew he acquired a debt anchor. He did not yet realize the anchor was chained to his throat. It was time to pull the chain. Your Honor, if I may, I said, breaking my silence. My voice rang clear and composed, a sharp contrast to the frantic energy bleeding from the respondent's table. Harrison nodded, granting me permission to speak. There is an additional layer of financial exposure the court must recognize, I stated, standing up from my chair and smoothing the front of my navy blazer. It pertains to the residential property awarded to Mr. Taylor in the settlement. Richard looked at me, his eyes wide with renewed terror. He knew exactly what I was about to say. A week ago, I visited the Overland Park residence to retrieve my corporate documents. I explained, keeping my gaze locked on my ex-husband, I discovered a final loan approval notice from a secondary lender hidden on the entryway table. It detailed a high-interest, short-term line of credit secured against the house. The signature on the authorization form was a forgery of my own name. Thorne snapped his head toward his client. You forged a secondary mortgage, the attorney hissed, his professional survival instincts kicking in. You told me the house was clear. Richard could not answer. He squeezed his eyes shut, his face turning a sickly shade of ash. I did not contest the award of the house today because I knew the property was already lost. I continued addressing the judge while watching Valerie out of the corner of my eye. Mr. Taylor secured that fraudulent loan to obtain immediate cash. He required rapid liquidity to fund his new lifestyle. He operated under the assumption that the LLC held $3 million in profit. He planned to use the corporate funds to pay off the forged mortgage before the first balloon payment came due. I turned my head, shifting my focus to the woman sitting in the front row of the gallery. Valerie sat rigid, her manicured hands gripping the wooden partition. He used the stolen capital from the forged residential loan to purchase a commercial storefront on Main Street, I said, delivering the fatal revelation. He bought the building to house a new bakery. He tethered the commercial deed to the residential collateral. Valerie stopped breathing. The color drained from her expensive cosmetics, leaving her face looking like a porcelain mask. Because Taylor Logistics is an empty shell, Mr. Taylor possesses zero liquid capital. I stated the final equation, laying out the inescapable math. He drained his remaining cash, fighting my attorney over a decoy offshore account. The balloon payment on the forged mortgage is due in 14 days. He has no money to service the debt. When he defaults, the secondary lender will initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings. They will seize the residential home in Overland Park, and because the commercial bakery is tied to the same fraudulent line of credit, the bank will seize that property as well. A heavy, suffocating quiet descended upon the courtroom. The intricate web of deception Richard spent months weaving had just pulled taut, trapping him inside. He tried to build a kingdom on a foundation of stolen money and willful ignorance. The foundation was gone. Valerie stood up from the gallery bench. Her ivory dress rustled in the silent room. She stared at the back of Richard's head, a look of profound revulsion twisting her features. The romantic fantasy, the European vacations, the custom drapery, the bustling commercial kitchen, all of it evaporated. She realized the man she left her comfortable life to join was not a financial titan. He was functionally bankrupt and potentially facing felony fraud charges. Judge Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, assessing the wreckage at the respondents' table. He did not offer counsel. He did not offer pity. He simply enforced the consequences of the law. "This court is not a shield for your own reckless greed, Mr. Taylor," the judge said, his voice cold and final. "You demanded the crown. You wear it. The bailiff will clear the room." Richard sat paralyzed. His face was a ghostly shade reflecting the total collapse of his future. He stared at the brushed steel table, his eyes glazed over, unable to comprehend the sheer velocity of his destruction. He thought he took everything from me. He never realized I spent 18 years holding the sky up over his head. I just stepped out of the way and let it crush him. I gathered my leather folio, slipping it into my structured handbag. I turned away from the respondents' table, leaving the ruins behind. It was time to walk out into the hallway and watch the survivors turn on each other. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B shut behind me with a solid, reassuring thud. The hallway stretched long and wide, bathed in the harsh fluorescent light of the county building. The polished marble floor reflected the scuffed shoes of attorneys pacing and clients whispering in huddled corners. The air here felt lighter, devoid of the oppressive tension that choked the room I had just exited. I adjusted the strap of my structured handbag on my shoulder. The leather felt cool against my palm. My breathing found a steady, deep cadence. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, I was not carrying the invisible ledger of another person's mistakes. Sarah Sterling stopped a few feet down the corridor, checking her mobile device. She offered a brief professional nod, signaling her departure toward the elevators. The trap was executed. Her job was done. My future was my own. Before I could take another step, the courtroom doors burst open. The heavy wood slammed against the metal wall stops, echoing like a gunshot down the quiet corridor. Richard stumbled into the hallway. The charcoal suit that looked so sharp 30 minutes ago now hung on his frame like borrowed clothing. His silver tie was pulled askew. The knot rested loose near his collarbone, exposing a sheen of panic sweat slicking his neck. He scanned the corridor, his eyes wide and frantic, until they locked onto me. "Isabel," he gasped, closing the distance between us with heavy, uncoordinated steps. He moved like a man fighting a strong current, dragging his feet across the marble. He stopped 3 feet away, blocking my path to the exit. His chest heaved. His hands shook violently at his sides. The arrogance that defined him, the smug certainty that he possessed a superior intellect, had dissolved into pure, unadulterated terror. He was cornered by the math he had refused to calculate. "You have to fix this, Isabel," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch. He reached out, attempting to grab my arm, but I took a measured step backward, denying him the physical contact. "You cannot leave me with that company. The penalties alone will bankrupt me by the end of the quarter. We can go back inside. We can tell the judge we made a mistake. We can renegotiate the settlement." I looked at the man I had married. I searched my own chest, expecting to find a flicker of residual sympathy, a lingering instinct to reach out and solve the crisis. I found nothing but cold, smooth stone. During our 2nd year of marriage, Richard decided he wanted to flip houses. He possessed 0 construction experience and no capital, but he possessed a surplus of blind confidence. He signed a predatory loan for a dilapidated property on the wrong side of the city. When the foundation cracked and the plumbing failed, he locked himself in our bedroom for 3 days, paralyzing our household with his despair. I took a second job, consulting on commercial leases, working 70-hour weeks to pay off the predatory debt and save our credit score. He emerged from the bedroom when the threat was neutralized, claiming he simply suffered a streak of bad luck. He always called it bad luck. He never called it incompetence. "There is no renegotiation, Richard," I said, keeping my tone quiet and precise. "You fired a competent attorney because he wanted to audit the ledgers. You hired a billboard lawyer because he promised you speed. You drafted the waiver. You signed the document holding me harmless. You demanded the keys to the kingdom." "I did not know the vault was empty," he argued, spittle flying from his pale lips. "You let me believe the cash was there. You set a trap." "I managed the risk for 18 years, I replied, holding his frantic gaze. "I balanced the sheets. I read the contracts. I protected you from the consequences of your own impulsive greed. You resented me for it. You thought my caution was an insult to your brilliance. You wanted to operate without a safety net." I gestured toward the closed courtroom doors. "You have your wish," I said. "You are flying without a net." The courtroom doors pushed open again, this time moving with a slow, deliberate, heavy motion. Valerie stepped into the hallway. The confident, expensive aura she carried into the gallery had vanished. Her face was a stark, rigid mask of pure fury. Her breath came in short, ragged intervals. She gripped her designer handbag so tight, her knuckles bruised white against the leather. She did not look at me. She marched directly toward Richard, her heels striking the floor like hammer blows. Richard turned toward her, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Valerie, sweetheart, we can fix this," he stammered, the words spilling out in a panicked rush. "I will call the secondary lender. I can ask for an extension on the balloon payment. I will figure out a payment plan for the bakery." Valerie stopped 2 feet from him. She stared at his face, inspecting the sweat, the fear, the pathetic desperation leaking from every pore. The illusion of the wealthy benefactor was shattered. She was looking at a man drowning in fraudulent debt. "You forged a mortgage," she whispered, her voice dripping with lethal venom. "You tied my bakery to a fraudulent loan." "I needed the capital to secure the property," he pleaded, reaching for her hand. "I was going to pay it off today. The money was supposed to be there. We just hit a minor setback." "A setback," she repeated, her voice rising, slicing through the ambient noise of the corridor. "The bank is going to seize the building, Richard. They are going to seize the residential house. You have 0 cash. You have a shell company drowning in environmental fines. You do not have a minor setback. You are destitute." "Valerie, please," he begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic whimper. "We can start over. I did not leave a comfortable life to start over with a bankrupt fraud." Valerie hissed the words echoing down the hall. "I did not spend the last year listening to you brag about your impending millions just to end up sleeping on a rented mattress. You told me you were building an empire. You built a graveyard." She reached down, grabbing her left hand. She pinched the large diamond engagement ring Richard had purchased with stolen credit funds. She pulled the metal band over her knuckle. The friction left a red mark on her skin. She threw the ring directly at his chest. The heavy diamond struck his lapel and bounced off, falling to the marble floor with a sharp, metallic clatter. It rolled a few inches before coming to a rest near his polished leather shoe. "Do not call me Valerie," said, turning on her heel. She walked away, her pace rapid and aggressive. She did not look back. Richard stood frozen, watching the woman he had destroyed his entire life to secure disappear around the corner toward the elevators. The silence left in her wake was profound. It was the sound of a man realizing every single bridge he ever built was currently burning to ash. Richard slowly lowered his head. He looked down at the discarded ring resting on the floor. He raised his left hand, bringing his palm up to wipe the cold sweat from his forehead. As his hand moved past his face, the fluorescent hallway lights caught the silver dial of his watch. It was the heavy imported chronometer he had purchased a few months ago, using the very last of our joint checking funds. It was the watch he bought to celebrate his independence. It cost $3,000. He rubbed his tired face, his fingers trembling against his skin. The metal casing of the timepiece gleamed, a cruel reminder of the wealth he had squandered. He stared at the watch on his wrist. His eyes widened slightly, the final, devastating piece of the equation clicking into place. He possessed no liquid accounts. His credit cards were maxed out on non-refundable Paris flights. The house was facing imminent foreclosure. He had nowhere to sleep tonight. I watched his gaze remain locked on the silver dial. He was running the pawnshop math in his head. He was calculating how many nights in a cheap roadside motel that watch would buy him. He was realizing that the symbol of his financial triumph was now the only thing keeping him off the street. I adjusted my grip on my folio. I turned my back on the broken man studying his own wrist. I walked down the long corridor toward the glass exit doors, letting the bright Kansas sunlight pull me forward. The autumn wind swept across the Missouri River, carrying the sharp chill of late October. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my new high-rise condominium in downtown Kansas City. The view stretched for miles, offering an unobstructed panorama of the urban skyline. The chaotic suburban sprawl of Overland Park felt like a distant, faded memory. I held a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, letting the warmth seep into my palms. The quiet inside my living space was absolute. It was a sterile, beautiful silence. I turned away from the glass and walked toward my minimalist glass desk. A fresh stack of embossed business cards sat near my laptop. They bore my maiden name. The new consulting firm was already securing lucrative commercial contracts. Without the dead weight of a husband constantly undermining my judgment, my professional reputation flourished. I was no longer spending half my week mitigating Richard's manufactured disasters. I poured all my strategic energy into my own growth. The return on that investment was immediate and staggering. I opened my laptop and navigated to the Johnson County Public Records database. It was a Friday morning ritual. I did not check the legal filings out of malice. I checked them the way a meteorologist tracks a hurricane system, making sure the destructive path remained far away from my shores. The foreclosure notice for the Overland Park property was officially finalized on Tuesday. The secondary lender had seized the deed. The bank evicted Richard 30 days after he missed the first balloon payment. The custom wooden trellis where I grew my prize-winning roses was likely rotting by now. The invasive vine that choked the life out of my garden had consumed the entire structure. The public ledger also detailed the fate of Valerie's commercial bakery. Because Richard tied her storefront deed to the fraudulent residential mortgage, the bank swallowed that property in the exact same legal motion. The contractors never installed the expensive ventilation system. The imported Italian tiles were never laid. Valerie lost her dream business before she ever baked a single loaf of bread. She abandoned Richard in the courthouse hallway 3 months ago, but the financial blast radius still managed to incinerate her future. Richard did not surrender gracefully. Cornered animals rarely do. 6 weeks ago, a process server knocked on the door of my high-rise carrying a thick stack of civil litigation papers. Richard attempted to sue me for fraudulent misrepresentation. He hired a cheap, desperate attorney who worked out of a strip mall, claiming I engineered a complex conspiracy to trick him into acquiring a toxic corporate shell. He demanded millions in compensatory damages. Sarah Sterling did not even bother to draft a lengthy defense. She filed a single motion to dismiss, attaching the notarized hold harmless agreement and the official transcript from the mediation session. We stood in front of Judge Harrison for exactly 12 minutes. The stern magistrate glared down from the bench, his patience entirely depleted. He looked at Richard's new lawyer with a mixture of pity and severe irritation. Counselor, your client signed a permanent waiver of financial discovery, Judge Harrison stated, his voice echoing through the quiet chamber. He explicitly indemnified his ex-wife from any liability associated with Taylor Logistics. He was warned on the official record. Filing a civil suit to reverse an ironclad decree because your client regrets his own arrogance is a profound waste of judicial resources. The judge slammed his gavel. The case is dismissed with prejudice, Harrison declared, meaning Richard could never file the lawsuit again. Furthermore, the court finds this litigation to be entirely frivolous. Mr. Taylor is hereby ordered to pay the full cost of the respondent's legal fees. Richard tried to protest, but the bailiff immediately ordered him to remain silent. He walked out of the courtroom that day carrying a new, insurmountable legal debt. He tried to strike me one last time, and the hammer simply rebounded, striking him directly in the jaw. The chime of my front door intercom pulled me back to the present. I walked over to the security panel and pressed the speaker button. The concierge informed me that my son was waiting in the lobby. I authorized the elevator access. A few minutes later, Thomas stood in my foyer. He wore a heavy wool coat, his shoulders slumped, carrying a visible weight. The last time we spoke, he accused me of hiding millions of dollars and ruining his father's life. He bought into the narrative Richard sold him. He believed the lie. Now the truth was public record. Thomas stepped into the living room, looking around the pristine, modern space. He took a deep breath, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He turned to face me, the guilt radiating from his posture. "Mom, I am so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. I closed the distance between us, wrapping my arms around my son. He returned the embrace, holding on to me tight. The quiet ache that lived in my chest for the past 3 months slowly dissolved. "You do not have to apologize, Thomas," I said, smoothing the fabric of his coat. "You trusted your father. That is what a son is supposed to do. He manipulated you. He weaponized your loyalty. The blame belongs solely to him." Thomas pulled back, swiping a hand across his eyes. "I visited him yesterday," he said, his tone dropping into a hollow register. "I went to the address he gave me." I gestured toward the soft leather sofa, offering him a seat. I sat in the adjoining armchair, waiting for him to process the experience. "It is a rented room in a boarding house near the industrial district," Thomas explained, staring at his hands. "The floor is cracked linoleum. He does not have real furniture, Mom. He is sleeping on an inflatable air mattress. His suits are hanging on a metal rack next to a hot plate." A brief, fleeting image of Richard adjusting his imported silk tie in the courthouse crossed my mind. "He looks terrible," Thomas continued, the pain evident in every word. "He lost weight. His hands were shaking. He asked me if I could loan him a few $100s to cover his portion of the utility bill. He told me he pawned his silver watch last month just to secure the security deposit for the room. The $3,000 chronometer, the symbol of his premature victory. He traded the ultimate trophy of his greed for a deflating piece of plastic on a cold floor." "Did you give him the money?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "No," Thomas replied, shaking his head. "I remembered what you told me about managing risk. If I give him cash, he will just sink it into another delusion. He needs to figure out how to survive on his own." A deep sense of pride swelled inside me. My son was learning the lesson it took me 18 years to master. You cannot save a drowning man who refuses to learn how to swim. If you jump into the water, he will only pull you under. We spent the next hour drinking coffee and discussing his architectural projects in Denver. We rebuilt our foundation laying new bricks of honesty and mutual respect. When Thomas finally left to catch his flight home, the condo felt warmer. The fractured pieces of my family were mending. I walked back to my glass desk. The morning mail sat in a neat pile near my laptop. I sorted through the envelopes, discarding the promotional flyers. I stopped at a rigid priority mail envelope bearing the return address of Sarah Sterling's law firm. I pulled the pull tab, ripping the cardboard open. Inside sat a single certified bank check. Attached to the check was a printed memorandum from the county clerk. It detailed a formal wage garnishment order. Because Richard refused to pay the court-ordered legal fees stemming from his frivolous civil lawsuit, Sarah filed an enforcement action. The state intercepted his remaining meager income, seizing the funds directly from his newly acquired entry-level sales job before the paycheck ever reached his bank account. I picked up the certified check. The amount covered every single billable hour Sarah charged me to defend the bogus lawsuit. I retrieved a black ink pen from my desk drawer. I flipped the check over. I pressed the ballpoint against the endorsement line and signed my maiden name. The ink dried instantly. I looked out the window, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Kansas City skyline. I thought about the man sleeping on an air mattress, blaming the world for a disaster he engineered. I did not plot his destruction. I did not seek a malicious vengeance. I simply stopped being his shield. I stepped out of the way of his own insatiable greed and let his momentum carry him straight off the cliff. The war was over. The horizon belonged entirely to me. 6 months after the ink dried on the final divorce decree, the Midwestern winter began releasing its grip on Kansas City. A brisk March wind swept through the downtown commercial district, carrying the faint scent of roasting espresso beans and damp asphalt. I walked out of a boutique coffee shop located 2 blocks from my consulting firm, holding a warm paper cup. The morning rush hour hummed around me, a symphony of moving vehicles and hurried pedestrians. I navigated the crowded sidewalk, my mind focused on a commercial lease negotiation scheduled for 10 o'clock. I stepped toward the intersection, waiting for the pedestrian signal to change. A figure shuffled up beside me, waiting for the same light. I did not recognize him at first. The man wore a faded gray overcoat that hung loose off his shoulders. The fabric looked thin, inadequate for the biting morning chill. His posture curved inward, a defensive slump that spoke of chronic defeat. Gray stubble patched his jawline. Deep lines etched permanent grooves around his mouth and eyes. He looked a decade older than the man who sat in the mediation boardroom, demanding the keys to an empire. He turned his head. Our eyes met. "Isabel," he said. His voice lacked the booming resonance it once carried. It sounded thin, raspy, and hesitant. "Hello, Richard," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I did not step back. I did not shrink. I stood my ground, holding my coffee, letting the reality of his decline wash over me. He stared at me, taking in my tailored wool trench coat, my steady gaze, and the quiet confidence radiating from my posture. The contrast between us was stark. I represented the life he discarded. He represented the fantasy he chose. "You look well," he murmured, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his thin coat. I noticed his left wrist was bare. The expensive imported chronometer remained sitting on a pawnshop shelf. "I am thriving," I stated, offering a simple, unvarnished fact. He swallowed hard. He looked down at the concrete sidewalk, studying the cracks in the pavement. The pedestrian signal chimed, glowing a bright white shape, indicating it was safe to cross. Neither of us moved. The crowd surged past us, leaving us stranded on the corner. "I owe you an apology," he whispered, the words sounding like dry leaves scraping across pavement. I waited. I let the silence hang between us, allowing the weight of his admission to settle. "I made a terrible mistake." He continued, risking a glance up at my face. "A blinding, foolish mistake. I did not understand how much you carried. I did not realize you held the entire world together. I thought I built it all myself. I was wrong, Isabel. I am so sorry." It was the apology I would have given anything to hear a decade ago. If he had spoken those words when our children were young, when we were struggling to balance the mortgage and his ego, I might have wept. I might have held his hand and promised to keep fighting for us. But time alters the value of an apology. When words arrive after the damage is irreversible, they hold zero currency. "You are not apologizing for betraying me, Richard," I said, my voice even and calm, carrying no malice, but offering zero comfort. "You are apologizing because you are suffering." His face flushed a dull red. "I mean it," he insisted, pulling his hands out of his pockets. "I lost everything. Valerie left. The bank took the house. My wages are garnished. I sleep on a plastic mattress. I see clearly now." I took a slow sip of my coffee. The dark roast tasted sharp and grounding. "You see consequences," I corrected him, pinning him with a steady stare. "You are confusing regret with remorse. Remorse requires a genuine sorrow for the pain you caused another person. Regret is simply sorrow for the pain you caused yourself." He opened his mouth to argue, but the truth caught in his chest. "If Taylor Logistics held $3 million in liquid cash," I continued, lowering my paper cup, "you would not be standing on this corner asking for my forgiveness. You would be walking down a European avenue holding a glass of champagne. You would not spare a single thought for my well-being. You are only sorry because the vault was empty." He closed his mouth. The fight drained out of him. He looked like a deflated balloon, a man hollowed out by his own arrogance. He possessed no counter-argument because he knew every word I spoke was true. "Take care of yourself, Richard," I said. I turned away from him and stepped into the crosswalk. I did not look over my shoulder. I heard the scuff of his worn shoes against the concrete, but the sound faded quickly, swallowed by the noise of the city. I left him standing on the sidewalk, a ghost lingering at the edges of a life that no longer belonged to him. I walked the remaining 2 blocks to my office building, entering the glass revolving doors. The lobby was bright and warm, filled with the quiet hum of commerce and ambition. I rode the elevator up to the 30th floor, reflecting on the journey that brought me to this specific morning. For 18 years, I believed my duty was to act as a human shield. I thought a successful marriage meant absorbing the shockwaves of my partner's bad decisions. Society conditions us to play the role of the silent architect. We lay the bricks, we pour the concrete, and we stand in the background while someone else cuts the ribbon and takes the photograph. We convince ourselves that our invisible labor is a noble sacrifice. But sacrifice should never require the surrender of your own dignity. When Richard demanded my keys and ordered me out of the home I built, he thought he was stripping me of my power. He assumed my strength derived from the bank accounts, the vehicles, and the property deed. He failed to recognize that the wealth was merely a byproduct of my intellect, my resilience, and my quiet endurance. He took the assets, he took the liabilities, he took the illusion of control. But he could never take the engine that generated the success, because the engine was me. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting for what's yours. It's letting them take what they think is valuable, knowing the true value was always you. We are taught to fight tooth and nail for our possessions during a betrayal. We are advised to hire loud lawyers to scorch the earth and split the atom, just to ensure the other person suffers an equal loss. We spend years locked in bitter litigation, trading thousands of dollars in legal fees for a twisted sense of justice. We anchor our souls to the very people who broke our hearts. I chose a different path. I chose the path of strategic surrender. I recognized that fighting a greedy man over a pile of toxic assets would only result in 2 ruined lives. By stepping aside, I allowed his own momentum to become his executioner. I gave him exactly what he demanded, and I let the sheer weight of his ignorance pull him under the water. The victory I achieved was not measured by the dollar amount in my checking account or the square footage of my high-rise condominium. My victory was the profound, unshakable peace I secured the moment I stopped trying to save him. Have you ever watched someone's arrogance become their own undoing? Have you ever witnessed a person demand the crown only to watch their necks snap under the weight of the gold? It is a quiet, tragic phenomenon to observe. You realize that true justice rarely requires your active participation. The universe possesses a remarkable accounting system. The ledgers always balance themselves eventually. If you are sitting in the dark right now, staring at the wreckage of a life you built for someone who took you for granted, I need you to listen closely. I need you to understand that your current grief is temporary. The panic you feel over losing the house or the savings account is just a passing storm. The foundation of your life is not tied to a bank routing number or a piece of jewelry. Your foundation is your mind. It is your capability. It is your grace under fire. Do not let a bitter partner convince you that your worth is negotiable. Do not engage in a muddy war with a person who thrives in the dirt. Rise above the conflict. Evaluate the board. Find the trap they are setting for themselves and politely hand them the hammer. You will rebuild. You will construct a new reality that is infinitely stronger than the one you left behind. You will find that the air breathes easier when you are no longer carrying the dead weight of someone else's ego. You will wake up one morning, pour a cup of coffee, and realize the ghost of your past no longer holds any power over your future. I built my empire twice. The first time, I gave the credit away. The second time, I kept the crown for myself. I would love to hear your thoughts on this journey. Have you ever had to walk away to win? Have you ever handed someone exactly what they asked for, knowing it would be their downfall? Drop your story in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from today. I read every single response. We share stories of resilience, quiet victories, and second chances every single day on this channel. We celebrate the unseen strength of individuals who refuse to be broken by betrayal. If this narrative resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment. Join our community of survivors and strategists. Until next time, protect your peace, guard your energy, and never let anyone convince you to fight a war you can win with silence. Take care of yourselves out there.